there's no doubt about the fact that historically, and at least until fairly recently, INFJs have had pretty strong, harsh, sometimes even tormenting superegos. The question of whether this is a specifically INFJ condition or not is a difficult one to answer. Certainly, many psychologists, psychiatrists, and psychoanalysts would argue that this has been our condition as a people, since at least for a very long time in most, if not all, societies, and is only gradually beginning to change in a more recent context, and particularly in Western societies, where the superego is, by all accounts, getting weaker. Now, that by way of a reminder, the superego is the agency of the self that is sometimes referred to as the inner critic. It's the agency of the self that regulates the behavior of the ego in terms of shoulds and should nots, in terms of rewards and punishment, in terms of guilt, in terms of shame, in terms of making sure that the ego has in mind, in view, and respect norms, rules, principles, codes of conduct in their particular society. As part of the superego, most of the time people integrate the ego ideal, the personification of who one would like to be, and conscience, understood here predominantly as moral conscience. The superego is harsh when people find it difficult to be relaxed because they feel like they always should be doing something instead of being lazy, or at least calling themselves lazy. In fact, the superego is harsh when one is judgmental toward others, because it is simply a fact that when one is judgmental toward others, unless one is a narcissist, in this case, separate issue. But if you're not a narcissist, if you're judgmental toward others, you're always covertly very judgmental towards yourself. This is a psychological, intangible law. So harshness of judgment toward others, toward oneself, difficulty forgiving oneself, feeling guilty, being motivated to do things by guilt, all these different things, and feeling a weight upon your shoulders, finding it difficult to just be, rather than being animated by a notion of who you should be, where you should be going. This is something I said in a recent video, when it comes to the particular INFJ experience, which is what I'm focusing on in my work usually, the INFJ has really integrated the superego in that way for a very, very long time. And what's really interesting, and I mentioned that in like I said in previous work, is that if your superego is really, really harsh, this will tend to come at the expense of your individuation. In fact, it will often come at the expense of your the maturation of your NI worldview, because very, very harsh superego tend to produce compliant INFJs. In fact, compliance and superego are very closely connected concepts, because the compliant INFJ introjects rules, norms, and principles, just like the superego. And compliant INFJs, is well known, tend to conceal, repress, ignore the needs of and the voice of NI. So from that perspective, having too strong a superego is a challenge, and is one of the reasons why there are so many invisible INFJs in society. The world is a world where there are a lot of invisible INFJs. That's not to say that INFJs are less rare than we assume them to be. I mean, I don't want to take a particular position in that respect. Sometimes these questions of who's the most rare, in fact, all the time, they are kind of popularity contests. They're clickbait strategies, ways of getting viewers, getting subscribers. You've seen that in a lot of the pseudo INFJ channels that you come across on YouTube. But the question is, rather than, there's a lot of people who probably assume they're sensing types, or at least non-INFJ types, non-NI dominant types, because they're in the business of ignoring the needs and voice of their NI function. That's often compliance, it's a giveaway for compliance. And in this case, we can say these people insofar as they do self-work, insofar as they try to bring some sense of solace and peace and quiet to their psyches, ought to really focus on this whole idea of guilt. Because at the end of the day, this is what is involved: masochism, guilt, self-punishment, and self-defeating attitudes. However, the superego is still important. And this is also where I want to get into more perspective mode, because it appears to be strongly the case that the newer generations, largely as a result, and again mostly in the West, and largely as a result of updated modes of parenting, trying not to reproduce the harsh disciplinarian approaches of the past, produced children, soon to become adults or already teenagers or adults, that don't have as harsh a superego. In fact, sometimes the superego is quite weak. And what the psychological case material seems to indicate, psychiatric and psychoanalytic, is that having too weak a superego is also an issue. It's also an issue because the superego, for all its harshness when it's too harsh, provides a frame. NI needs a frame. NI is such a free-floating function. It doesn't really have a lot of structure in and of itself. You need some FETI grounding, and you need some superegoic kind of framing for NI to fully express itself. The superego should not be too strong, but it should not be too weak either. And it does appear to be the case. Based on my interactions with a lot of younger INFJs on Discord servers particularly, like I'm talking INFJs between the ages of 18 and 26, let's say 18 and 26, INFJs and INTJs, NI dominance. I've interacted with quite a few of those, and it's never ceases to strike me that their perceiving functions are quite visible, NI and SE, right? That axis is visible in their ideation, their way of writing, even the way they behave and look sometimes. But there tends to be a repression, not of NI in this case, as in the case of our friend, the compliant INFJ, a repression of the functions of judgment, not just FE, but also TI, right? So you just get this, sometimes they're called polarized, NI dominance, just kind of constantly switching or flowing between NI and SE, but without much intervention of what I consider to be the functions of the superego in many ways, FE and TI, or FI and TE in the case of the INTJ. And I can see in those teenagers and adults that there is a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of a sense that life has no meaning. There's a struggle against nihilism. There's difficulty with procrastination, with just consuming and processing in the consumption and not in producing. So the NI is not repressed in this instance. The SE is not repressed. The whole axis of NI-SE is very much there. And yet there is anxiety, there's a lack of productivity, there is depression, and there is a sense of inner emptiness. So it appears, by no means, that all the coming generations will be like this, that there might be a slightly higher proportion of INFJs coming with new kinds of struggles. Types of struggle that are not the insecurity of the adaptive and the solipsist, because these newer generations of INFJs, at least those that I'm describing, if I'm correct about this, won't be solipsists. It's wrong to assume that the solipsists, with the exception perhaps of the pure anti-solipsists, are like that. Because in fact, even the pure anti-solipsist, I'm starting to understand, has a hidden harsh superego in the form of TI. It doesn't manifest in the same way as the NI-TI solipsist. I'll have to kind of redefine those terms, slightly update them at some point. But there is still in the solipsist decision to retreat from the world from a judgment that the world is bad in some manner of speaking for them. So the focus on the NI investment is deliberate and is a result of a prior judgment. Whereas in the case of those younger INFJs and younger INTJs, younger NI dominants, often what you see is they're quite happy to be in the world, even though the world might be their bedroom. There is consumption of all sorts of stuff on the internet that is not a mobilization of NI per se. This is just constant flowing between NI and SE without much of a result in terms of a concrete encapsulation or incarnation of what they have been developing in terms of worldview ever really appearing. There's an intangibility, there's a sense of floating, and often there's a sense of inner emptiness. And I will conclude with those words. I think that the evolution of society, because society is always evolving, our classification of personality types, at least from this perspective, will also evolve. We have to continue tracking the way society progresses. Probably will, at some point, impel me to propose at least one more subtype of INFJ. This subtype that is not quite solipsistic, that is not compliant, but is not secure either or spiritualized. And this is the INFJ of the future. He or she already exists, but we will come to see them more and more, I believe. So let me know in the comments what you thought, guys. Give me a like if you enjoyed this vid. Don't forget, I've written 2 books on this beautiful type called the INFJ, The Infinite Soul being my latest, INFJ Life in the Modern World, and how INFJs can lead productive, purposeful and meaningful lives in a world that we often consider very hostile. Check the reviews at the link below and get the book if you're interested, as well as its prequel, if you haven't already, the Ecstatic Soul, the 2 first books in the Soul series. A new look at the INFJ personality, and this is the book that looks, this is, of any book on the internet, the deepest investigation into the mind of the INFJ. So if you're interested, check the reviews. They're very positive. They helped a lot of people. So that's for the 2 books. And as usual, guys, don't forget that I am very much appreciative for your kind donations on my Patreon page. There's a link to my Patreon page down below. I could not do it without you. You are almost my only source of income as far as my video content. So I'd be so grateful if you supported my work so I can keep going with my videos. And you know, you can get some really good perks too. Access to our Discord server only for members, and bonus videos every 2-3 weeks where I go in depth about a video on a topic of your choosing, and other perks besides. Okay guys, so hopefully see you there, and I talk to you soon. Bye bye.